Hi class, welcome. It's Wednesday and I'm going to be lecturing today on the rest of toddlerhood. I realized we're quite far behind, and depending on which section of CDE 232 you're in, I'll pick up on this slide. A couple of you in the earlier section at 8:35, you can go ahead and fast forward to the slide that we left off on Monday, but I'll pick up here for the 9:40 section, okay? So in toddlerhood, we know that vocabulary and language is growing quite rapidly throughout toddlerhood, but it begins slowly. From about 1 year to 18 months, there's a slow expansion of language. So it begins with the use of hollow phrases. Hollow phrases are essentially using one word to signify a much more complex sentence. So a child or a toddler will say milk instead of may I have milk, or they might say up instead of please pick me up. So they use just one word in a hollow phrase to signify an entire long complex thought, but their parents are usually able to perceive that they mean that whole long extended sentence that they can't yet produce. Two other common things that happen during toddlerhood are that children begin to use overextensions. So this is when they use one word to mean many different items. For example, in this case, fork, they would use that word fork to mean any type of utensil that you eat with. So they would call a spoon a fork and a knife a fork, even though there's different specific names for a fork. For it, like the spoon and the knife is what I meant. And then similarly, they can underextend words, like they might think that only the dog at their house is a dog, that no other dogs they see on the street are also dogs. So they say, no, that's not a dog. This is a dog. We have a dog. So that's underextending the word when it should be more generalized. And in this case, only calling sippy cups cups, but not glasses that you would drink out of also cups. That's another example of an underextension. We're going to see a little video here that I think I forgot to show the 8:35 section. So we're going to see a little video on a toddler overextending.
Who is that? Big Bird? Is that, who is that? Oh, that's Ernie. That's Ernie. And Maya, who is that? Oh, is that Grover? Grover. Okay. And who is that? Is that Big Bird? Who is that? Big Bird. Okay. And who is that? Who is that? Big Bird. That's right. And who is that? Oh, is that Big Bird too? And, oh, and who is that? This is Big Bird? Who is that? This is Cookie Monster, Maya. Look, this is Cookie Monster. Who is that?
All right, so I'm going to stop it there because I think you get the sense that this toddler is calling most of the characters from Sesame Street Big Bird, with the exception of Grover, it seems. Grover has a special name, but Big Bird, Elmo, Cookie Monster, they all have the same name as Big Bird. So this child is overextending that phrase that is hard for you and I to understand, right? We don't realize the child is saying Big Bird because it sounds like she's just saying Beba. But the mother can decipher what the child is saying because she spends a lot of time with the child and she knows that the child is intentionally using those sounds to indicate that is a character Big Bird. Of course, the child is overextending that word, which is really, really common in this time frame from 12 months to 18 months. After 18 months, things get more specific. They tend to be more perceptive to feedback and editing their categories for different words. But their first 50 words will be words that are part of their everyday routine. So blanket, milk, mom, dad, car, dog, and maybe their pet's name. All of these first 50 words are going to be words that are useful for them to convey when trying to communicate with their parents. Then there comes an explosion of new vocabulary where their learning of words doubles from 18 months forward. They start doing what we call fast mapping, where they're learning new words on the daily. Like essentially they hear a new word, they learn what its intended meaning is, and then they will use that word and apply it in an appropriate way within the same day. So this fast mapping is, again, learning and remembering a word for an object after only one exposure to that word, only one time hearing that new word. So let's say that a child goes to the zoo for the first time, and before they go to the zoo, they've seen a horse before at a farm. So when they're looking at all the different animals at the zoo, they first see a camel and they say that's a horse. So they're overextending that word to apply to a camel. The parent says, no, that's not a horse. It still has 4 legs and it's a tall animal, but see the humps on the back? Camels have these types of humps. And with just that one exposure, the child will learn what a camel is in comparison to a horse, what differentiates the two from one another. Similarly with zebra look a lot like horses, but they have a very specific pattern on their body, these stripes, and that's how we know that they're zebras. And so with one differentiation, one time that parent labeling that new animal, they start to create new categories and a new understanding of this animal they've never seen before. They're fast mapping. The other thing they start to do beyond 18 months is they start to use telegraphic speech. So 2 word phrases that strip away any connecting words, like any prepositions or articles, are no longer used in these, they're not used at all in telegraphic speech. And telegraphic speech gets its name from the use of communicating via telegram. So in telegrams, you know, at least 100 years ago when we were communicating via telegram, you wouldn't put in the words the, and, through, for. None of those words would need to be included, only the bare minimum to communicate your idea. And that's what's happening with telegraphic speech in toddlers. They're typically only using 2 word phrases, such as milk please or dada up, to signify a much more complex sentence. Similar to hollow phrases, remember hollow phrases are only a 1 word used to signify a whole complex sentence. Telegraphic speech is different though, because at least 2 words are used and they're put in the correct order. So milk please signifies give me milk please, and dada up is dada please pick me up. So dada comes first after the action of up, and milk comes before the polite word of please. But it is ordered in such a way that reflects the true syntax of the language that is spoken by the child. That's something that's really unique and interesting about telegraphic speech. And that's a great symptom of greater, more complex language to come, that they're starting to understand the order in which words should be presented. So during their 3rd year, toddlers become much more adept at language. They don't use as much overextension or underextension because, again, they're becoming more sensitive to the feedback of the adults in their lives that are correcting them when they apply a word inaccurately. And they show, again, a greater understanding of the rules of language, which we call syntax. So in English, oftentimes our syntax is subject, verb, object, that exact order. It can be switched up to make more complex sentences, but usually a child who you ask them what they did that day, they might say, I went to the market, or I went to school. So subject, I, verb, went, and object is the place that they went to. What happens though with a lot of their speech at this point and at the third year of being a toddler and practicing with languages, as they learn the rules of syntax, they start to over-regularize words. And this is different from overextending words. Over-regularizing words has to do with changing or conjugating a word in such a way, treating it like a regular verb or a regular noun. So a regular verb, if we want to put it in the past tense, we just add ed, and suddenly that verb becomes a past tense verb, like walked, talked, hiked, looked. All of those are regular verbs. But there's a lot of irregular verbs in English. So words or verbs such as go, hit, eat, hurt, they're conjugated irregularly. And so when a child tries to use those words and put them in the past tense, they say, I goed to the market, she hitted me, or I eated a banana. And we kind of smile because we know how to actually conjugate that irregular verb. But they need the feedback from us in order to correct these over-regularizations of speech. And the same is true of making a word plural. So mouse is an irregular noun that changes to mice when it becomes plural. But a toddler at this age would very naturally change it to mouses because they have learned that a word that ends in an E sound, or a silent E, you would just have to put an S at the end of it. Mouses, that must be the way to say more than one mouse. But we know, again, that that is an irregular noun, and so it has to be changed in a different way. You can't say shoeses, or let's see, clothes is, you have different types of ways that you treat words, like a moose or a sheep that is already plural, even though, it's hard to explain to a child, sheep is plural already. We don't have to change it. But this type of feedback has to be given to the child so that they make fewer and fewer errors that are, again, common to this year of toddlerhood. So now I'm going to talk about some research on children's language skills or their vocabulary based on the socioeconomic status of their household. And so this is some research that is quite old, but there are a lot of signs that point toward the fact that it does matter that the amount or the variation of vocabulary that you're exposed to will add or subtract from, your own vocabulary as a child. So if you come from a professional household where your parents have education, perhaps at least a college degree, you are going to be exposed to many, many more words in a single hour of time than a child who comes from a working class household or a lower class household. They just don't get as much varied vocabulary exposure. So some research suggests that social class really does matter when it comes to the size of vocabularies that we build as young children. So the average child who is from a family that is on welfare is exposed to approximately 616 words per hour. And this compares to a child who's coming from a middle class working household, and that child is going to learn double the amount of words in a single hour. So 1,251 words, so twice the amount of the child whose parents are on welfare. And the child that is from a professional family will hear or be exposed to almost twice the amount of those children that are in the working class family. So here we see that the exposure, all of them are exposed to language. As Noam Chomsky would say, all of them are going to learn language, right? But the researchers Hart and Weasley would say yes, but the exposure will affect the size of the vocabulary that the children have. So how can you, as a parent, regardless of your SES, be more encouraging of your children learning more language, learning more vocabulary skills? One of them is to simply affirm the things that your child says and then to build on them. So if you're looking out the window and you see a tree, you could say, yes, that is a tree. That is a Palo Verde. That's a specific kind of tree that, you know, pretty much they only are in Arizona. And Palo Verde, which many of you may or may not know, means, you know, a green bark. And so the tree has green bark, and that's how it gets its name. It's a very different looking tree than you might see outside of the desert. So this is expanding on their knowledge, giving them more information. They're learning a lot more about the world around them as you add and expand on to what they point out in their close vicinity. So expanding on what they say is correlated with earlier milestones in language. And, you know, it is the case that potentially these households of higher SES might have the opportunity or less stress and the opportunity to be more supportive, to be more present and respond to their children's, their toddlers' observations about the world around them. Okay, so shifting away from language, we're going to dive into some emotional development of toddlers. This is a very turbulent, perhaps volatile time for young children because they are gaining the language skills to express what they want, right? But they can't really understand when they can't get their way, that they're not always going to be able to get their way, even though they've formulated that sentence or that telegraphic speech to tell you what they want. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to get it. So it's really challenging for them. They're developing what we know as emotional regulation. This advances in at least 4 different ways during toddlerhood and especially in early childhood, the next chapter we're going to dive into. So behaviorally, they have to learn things that they can and cannot have or do. They're using language to convey what they want. And if you say, you know, no, you can't have that candy or you can't have that toy, they're saying, but I want that toy. So they're using their language to say, but hey, wait a second, I'm telling you I want it. Shouldn't I be able to get it then? And you are trying to train them in what is an appropriate way to respond or behave in that situation. Of course, there's social demands, right? There's external requirements of how one is supposed to behave in a public space. And the grocery store is one of the best places to see this in action. This, you know, push and pull between what the toddler may want and what is socially expected of behavior in this public space. You know, you can't cry about this because you're going to disturb everyone in this space. They have to learn what's the appropriate type of response for not being able to get something. But again, you know, they're still building these socio-moral emotions at the same time that might help them overcome this hurdle of not getting what they want to get. But it's a real dance for them until their emotion regulation advances far enough so that they can kind of sit back in their grocery cart and say, okay, I understand, and maybe distract themselves so that they're not thinking so much about that toy or that, you know, that candy that their parents said they couldn't have. So during this time, the terrible twos emerges, possibly due to their increased sense of self, their increased sense of being able to verbalize their own desires, their own volition, and yet not always being able to get their way. So we think of like the terrible twos or the three-nager, as they talk about 3-year-olds. They get really sassy and upset when they don't get their way. And this has a lot to do with them not mastering emotion regulation yet. So it will take time for them to overcome this hurdle and become much more relaxed children during the early childhood phase. So some primary emotions that develop during infancy are, let me back up a second, you know, joy, sadness, fear, disgust. I'm trying to think if and anger. These are very basic primary emotions that we see or may remember being depicted in the Pixar film. I think it's a Pixar film, Inside Out. Maybe it's a Disney film, or maybe those are both related. Nevertheless, These are primary emotions that are developed in the first year of life. And then toddlerhood is when they begin to develop social emotions. And these emotions are much more complex than those initial primary emotions. They may include, for example, being prideful of something that the toddler accomplished, like they just were able to go down the big kid slide, for example. Or it could be guilt, feeling bad after their parents said they couldn't have something, and feeling, kind of ashamed of their request in the first place. Or it could be envy, like wanting something that another toddler has. These are all examples of social emotions, sometimes called secondary emotions. So guilt, shame, embarrassment, a lot of these first social emotions listed here map onto Erik Erikson's central conflict during toddlerhood, which is, guilt versus autonomy, or shame versus autonomy. So they either are able to be successful in their own endeavors as a toddler, or they feel bad. They kind of get stuck in feeling bad whenever they're reprimanded for something that they did wrong. Envy and pride, again, I've already mentioned, are other social emotions that they develop during this time as they become more of a social being, maybe attending daycare or eventually preschool, and they learn that they can't always get what they want, or that they learn that, sometimes when they attempt things, they can be successful, and they'll get that verbal praise or affirmation from a parent or a teacher that is acknowledging their accomplishment. Empathy is also something that toddlers begin to express. It is really, really important because it demonstrates that they understand what the other person is feeling, and that other person has a unique, different perspective from themselves. So they're able to understand and respond and maybe help that person who is in distress. Maybe they saw a child, for example, fall down on the playground and scratch their knee, and so they might rush over to see if they need help. This is a symptom of empathy because they acknowledge that must have hurt, and they want to do something to help out. They would want somebody to help them in that same situation. So it's a very important socio-moral emotion that they're starting to develop during toddlerhood. Another thing that they start to think about outside of pain, if they have something that they know they would want, and if it wasn't in their possession, they might try and share it with another child during this phase. They might develop pro-social behavior that we see depicted in this picture between these two toddlers. The boy has some ice cream, and the girl doesn't have any, as far as we can tell. And so he's sharing his ice cream with her because if he were in her shoes, right, her mental shoes, he would want another child to share ice cream with him. So this is behavior that's intended to help or benefit others, or treat others as you would want to be treated, kind of that golden rule type of behavior. Of course, there's cultural differences on emotions. For example, in the United States, the secondary emotion that we were talking about on the prior slide, pride, is really viewed in a positive light. It would be something that would be encouraged among children within the United States or in other, developed, more individualistic countries like Great Britain. However, in more collectivistic nations such as China or Japan, they would look down on a child who is a toddler expressing this feeling of pride in something that they accomplished, because they see pride culturally as a danger, as a way of trying to differentiate yourself from the group. And so they would not try and reinforce or praise that type of emotion displayed by a toddler. All right, so in toddlerhood, beyond just mere emotions, this is a time when toddlers start to begin forming a distinct sense of self, of who they are, how they are different from other people in their life. And so with that comes some self-awareness. They reflect on how they are different from or distinct from the rest of the external world. For example, their parents, their classmates, what is distinct or different about themselves. And with that becomes this ability to recognize themselves as unique and separate from other people. So if they're presented with this mirror, this is a very typical paradigm for young toddlers. We see this toddler who's looking in the mirror and touching the mirror, almost like reaching out for another child, right? The child has something on their nose. It looks like a little bit of ink or paint or something. They believe that ink or paint is on another person. They're looking out, maybe trying to tell that other toddler about this ink on their nose. This child here in this picture does not have self-recognition, because if the child knew what they themselves looked like, then when presented with a mirror and a mark on their nose, they wouldn't reach out. Instead, they would reach toward themselves and try and rub that mark off. So by rubbing off that mark, they're indicating to researchers that they have mastered self-recognition. They know who they are. They can even point themselves out in pictures that are shown to them as well. They can also think about themselves as they would think about others. So they think about themselves as a unique person who is separate from other people, and that they might want something that someone else doesn't want, or vice versa. They have this ability to really reflect on who they are uniquely from other people. During toddlerhood, with this rise in self-awareness comes this awareness that they have a distinct gender. And gender is something that's culturally created, right? Our sex is actually what we are at birth, the type of chromosome that was given to us by our father. So we either were given a Y chromosome and we're the sex of male, or your father gave you an X chromosome and you're the sex of female. But gender is something that is constructed with time in a context. So beyond being male or female, gender is something that is created, these expectations of how one is supposed to behave if they're a boy or a girl. What are they supposed to wear? What are toys that they're supposed to play with? Again, it doesn't always mean that they have the best cultural prescriptions for gender, but that they exist even if we try to do away with them. So our culture is communicating, for example, if you walk down a toy aisle at like Walmart or Target, they communicate very distinct expectations for boys and girls. They color the aisles for boys blue and the aisles for girls pink. This might have changed recently in Target because they were actually criticized for this and responded in kind, but still it doesn't change the fact that the packaging of most toys targeted for girls are pink and for boys are blue. And here we have a very exact example of the types of messages we are communicated from the age of 2 or 3. Girls are supposed to be nurses and boys are supposed to be doctors. Now that's not accurate, right? A girl could be a doctor and a boy could be a nurse. But as soon as toddlerhood, or even before that, when a mother's pregnant with a child, if she knows she's having a boy or girl, suddenly she has a flood of a certain color of item for a boy or a girl, depending on what that is. These are communications or gender messages that are quite difficult to break down or protect your child against. So, for example, in one study by Sidorowicz and Looney in 1998, this is again quite an older study, but if an adult was playing with a male child, if they were told, again, this child was dressed in a gender neutral way, so the adults in the study didn't actually know the true gender of the baby. Instead, the researcher was either labeling the baby as a girl or a boy. So if the researchers told the adults in the study that's a boy, baby, then the adults, at least 50% of the men chose to play with a football with that child, and 80% of the women chose to play with a football with that child that was labeled as a boy. Similarly, if the baby was identified as a girl, then the adults, 89% of the men chose to pick up a doll to play with the child, and 73% of the women chose the same doll to play with the child. So we certainly at an unconscious level choose specific toys to interact with children depending on their gender. And this is something that is hard to overcome because both male and female adults do this. We speak differently to female children than to male children, and we accept or don't accept very specific behaviors from both of them. So there's this gender socialization that is happening from a very, very early age, and children pick up on this, that they're not supposed to be rough and tumble if they're a girl, or if they're, you know, boys that possess like really strong leadership skills are labeled as leaders, and girls that possess similar skills are labeled as bossy, as something negative. So these are things that happen very early on, unfortunately, and are challenging for us to overcome as a culture. It has to be literally an entire cultural shift if we want to move the needle on how gender messages are conveyed to young children. So we do know in some cases that there seems to be an evolutionary explanation for why we behave certain ways with little girls and little boys. And it suggests that these differences, or the differences in the gender messages we convey to them, are trying to promote some kind of survival of the species. So, for example, males are encouraged to be aggressive because they might need to actually protect their families or protect the people that they love. So the different characteristics of being competitive or trying to be dominant in a group of other boys are very much reinforced by adults in their environment, on average, of course. And similarly, little girls are encouraged to be nurturing, right? This is why they have baby dolls that they care for, because potentially one day, again, from an evolutionary standpoint, they might have to care and raise their own children. And so being emotionally responsive and cooperative and loving and sensitive as a female is something that may be valuable and also ensure the survival of her children. So these are some explanations as to why these gender messages have been sent in a very specific way to little boys and little girls from a very young age. The evolutionary explanation of this is that they needed to receive these messages to ensure that the human species would continue to survive and move forward and procreate and all of those things. All right, so we're going to take a shift away from gender for a moment. I want to talk more in a detailed fashion about the theory of attachment that was proposed by John Bowlby. I mentioned it at the end of the infancy chapter last week. We know that historically there's been this thought that, you know, we're trying to reduce a physical state of distress for infants and toddlers alike. And so there's been 3 important findings that have been made within the field of attachment. One is that there are emotional delays. Emotional delays can develop even with infants physically provided for. So, you know, I don't think we saw it yet, the video on the children that were in the Romanian orphanages. But just because you're given food doesn't necessarily mean that you develop an attachment for that caregiver who provides you food. You also need language and touch and affection, and all of those things are very, very important in addition to simply the basic, you know, food, water, changing your diaper, those basic needs that are met. What Harry Harlow found in his research is that baby monkeys actually spent more time with a cloth monkey because it was comfortable and soothing than the monkey, the wire monkey over here on the left, that provided food for them. So they still grew a greater attachment to that caregiver or that fake mother who was just soft and cuddly, and that they felt, you know, could soothe them if they needed to feel safe. And this again underscores the fact that there's something more to attachment than simply providing for basic needs. In fact, you know, touch, affection, comfort, those are all really critical components of building a strong, secure attachment to a parent figure. And Konrad Lorenz, in his ethology, suggested that some animals bond with mothers instantaneously. So in the case of the goslings who were following him around, the baby geese, they imprinted on him. They imprint on the first moving object. That's the case for many animal species, and it's a survival tactic so that they hopefully imprint on their mother. She provides them guidance, care, food, and love, and that ensures their survival. In the case of his own field work, he was able to get goslings to actually imprint on him, and he provided for them. So he was able to successfully raise them, provide them guidance, and so it suggested that there might be a sensitive period in time in which some form of attachment is critical for a young infant or child to develop, so that they do develop more normally in their relationships with other humans. So Bowlby concluded that attachment is an emotional bond. It's not just about the basic needs, the physical needs, meeting those physical needs. Instead, having an emotional bond with a parent promotes their protection and survival. So the child has to feel safe with their parent, and you know, most children are going to have a primary attachment figure, one parent that they are very securely attached to. They can be securely attached to both parents. It's possible. But they generally have one parent that they kind of cling to and have that primary connection with. Of course, attachment serves an evolutionary purpose to ensure that they will, in fact, survive their infancy and toddlerhood years. As a child gets older, they start to develop some stranger anxiety if they have to go to a babysitter's or a daycare or a new preschool. They get really upset and nervous when they're separated from their parent. And this is natural for a child who has developed a positive, secure attachment to their parent. So to build on Bowlby's theory of attachment, one of his graduate students, Mary Ainsworth, developed a procedure to try and categorize toddlers into either a secure attachment category or other types of insecure attachment. And we're going to see a video that demonstrates what this paradigm that she created, Mary Ainsworth, it's called the strange situation. It's a paradigm she developed to be able to categorize children into these different styles of attachment. So we'll see what that looks like in this little clip.
But can the essential elements of home life be translated into a standard laboratory setting for controlled scientific study? After conducting extensive observations of parents and children at home, a student of Bowlby's, Mary Ainsworth, devised such a procedure called the strange situation, which places the child under some stress. It has become the most widely used, standardized way to assess the quality of a child's attachment to their caregiver. Here the researchers are recording how 14-month-old Lisa responds in this attractive but unfamiliar setting. How will she react to a stranger? What will happen when her mother leaves the room? And when she returns? It's Lisa's behavior when her mother returns, what psychologists call the reunion, that they are particularly interested in.
Most importantly is to look for the type of balance that a child strikes between an attachment need and, on the other hand, to explore the play material.
Once Lisa has settled down to play, a stranger enters the room and sits in the chair reading a magazine.
Lisa, where's the bow? Where's the bow?
After a couple of minutes, the stranger attempts to interact with Lisa.
I just want to pause it right there to point out that the moment that the stranger tries to interact with the child turns back to her mother and kind of reaches for her. She's using her mother as a secure base and kind of asking her, am I safe to interact with this stranger? Should I continue to interact with them? So she's looking for some reassurance from her mom in that very moment. She's using her as a secure base.
Soon after, Lisbeth gets a cue to leave the room. The stranger tries to comfort Lisa, but in vain. Lisbeth comes back into the room and the camera records how Lisa reacts. Now the first part of the procedure is over, and Lisbeth settles Lisa down again. The stranger leaves them alone together. And soon after, Lisbeth goes too. Lisa is on her own. Her distress is plain to see. Once again, the efforts of the stranger to console Lisa are to no avail. But Lisbeth manages to calm her almost at once, and shortly afterwards the observation ends. Lisa showed outward signs of what's called secure attachment. But can the essential...
So let me just pull this back for a moment. We'll get back to our slides. So what she was able to show in that video essentially was that when the mother leaves, the child doesn't want to have anything to do with a stranger. In fact, the child even approaches the door to try and go after the mother. And when the mother returns the first time, she's easily soothed. She approaches her mother and calms down. When the mother leaves again, and she's left to her own devices again with a stranger, she wants to have nothing to do with the stranger. And in the second reunion, again, is quickly calmed down. So this is the behavior of a child who is securely attached, and that's the most positive, healthy form of attachment. But there's many other styles of attachment a child could have. So now that we've seen the strange situation, I will describe how a child with that category of insecure attachment would respond in the same situation. So what we saw in the video was a child with secure attachment. She was using her mother as a secure base to, try and evoke whether she should interact with this stranger or not. She cried when she was separated from her mother, and then returned to her mother and was easily soothed when her mother reappeared, both times. But a child who doesn't have a secure attachment with their parent, again, this is valid for a mother, father, perhaps the child is securely attached to a older sibling or a grandparent. That's also very common. But in the case that they don't develop this positive secure attachment, they develop a type of insecure attachment. So the first one is an avoidant attachment. They don't really interact with the mother when the stranger is in the room, and whether the mother leaves or returns, they don't really respond to the mother in any particular way. They kind of avoid that mother, whether they're in the room or they return to the room. They don't kind of, acknowledge the mother in any shape or form. Another type of attachment that is, again, not positive is an insecure resistant attachment. This is less likely to, this is when the child is less likely sorry, less likely to return, shows distress upon, okay. The child itself shows distress upon separation when the mother or father leave the room, and as if they don't really care when the parent returns. This suggests in some way that the child is receiving inconsistent care. So they are upset when they're separated, but they're not easily soothed or calmed by the presence of the parent. The last and perhaps most destructive form of attachment a child can form is a disorganized, disoriented attachment. This child exhibits really unusual behavior. They might look dazed or confused when the mother leaves and feel fearful or scared when the mother returns. Sometimes this is the result of child being mistreated, and other times it can be the result of the child having a neurological disorder. So it's not necessarily always the fault of the parent. Also, you have to keep in mind the disposition, the different characteristics of the child, him or herself, that might contribute to that style of attachment. So what we see cross-culturally speaking is that the predominant form of attachment that is observed in all of these developed countries is a secure attachment. And then it's interesting to note that, for example, in Japan, we see more insecure resistant attachment as opposed to insecure avoidant attachment. Man, having a hard time with the words today, guys, sorry. And in every other culture, may have something to do with this more collectivistic component of Japanese culture, perhaps, that leads to this other unusual type of insecure resistant attachment, as opposed to in like the United States or Germany, where we see more insecure avoidant attachment on average, and that like if they're going to form an insecure style of attachment. So attachment theory suggests that the quality of attachment is influenced by how sensitive the parent is, not just the mother, but whoever is caring for the infant. They need to be sensitive or responsive to what the child needs at any given time. They're not, sometimes attending to them and other times ignoring them, but instead they are consistently attending to the needs of their child. And this is similar to their level of responsiveness. How quick are they to assist or soothe their child? For example, if they fall down, are they going to run to them and try and comfort them? That's a type of, that would be exhibiting some responsiveness on the part of the parent. To try and soothe them when they're upset, which is very different from just simply providing the needs that they need. This is a more emotional type of care. Bowlby suggested that one's internal working model of attachment, so whether you had a secure attachment when you were a young child or some type of insecure or disoriented, disorganized attachment, will affect or apply to other relationships you build. So children who have secure attachments are more quick to trust and build friendships as young children, and later romantic relationships. But children who have these insecure styles of attachment, and particularly that disorganized, disoriented style of attachment, this affects the quality of their relationships, both with friends and romantic partners for the long term, not just in the short term. So research is quite mixed, but we know that disorganized attachment does seem to be predictive of a lot of later problems in development, such as perhaps conduct disorders is really common for these children, or other neurological diagnoses, for example. People who are critics of the attachment theory might say that, children are born with a lot of different temperaments. It's not just how responsive or sensitive the caregiver is, but instead it really does matter what kind of temperament the child has. Because if they have a more difficult temperament, it might be more challenging for the mother to be the sensitive, responsive parent that he or she, wants to be. Remember that influence is bidirectional. So it's not just the parent affecting the behavior of the child, but the child affects how the parent actually does their parenting. And so if the child is difficult or fussy all the time or really shy, it might require a different level of care from the parent. And if they aren't necessarily a good fit for the child, then the child might have a difficulty forming this secure, positive attachment. Some cultural critiques are that, while we saw in the previous slide, attachment is recognizable across different cultures, it may vary, like it may not always be the result of a certain type of parenting style. We know in the United States, for example, and we haven't talked about it yet, but the most common parenting style in the United States is the authoritative parenting style, which would yield a really strong correlation to a positive, secure attachment for the child. But we see in other cultures that, authoritarian parenting style is more common, and still there's a similar level of secure attachments formed across the children in that culture, regardless of the style of parenting that we see commonly within that culture. So this may vary on classifying how you classify insecurely attached infants, which can be challenging. There's not a really clear-cut way, and like you see, it could be difficult depending on how you code the behavior of the toddler or the infant to classify the child as insecure avoidant or insecure resistant. So this is something that is still, there's still a lot of measurement error there that might need to be addressed in future types of measures that would categorize the style of attachment of a toddler. So we haven't mentioned too much about fathers yet. And I'm going to talk about fathers on this slide because there has been a burgeoning field of father research with children. We know, at least in traditional cultures, that fathers had tended to be prescribed this provider or disciplinarian type of role. They're the breadwinner, they might not be around or as visible as we saw, for example, in the Babies documentary. The one father we really saw the most was Hattie's father. So I want you to keep that in mind as I talk through this slide. In turn, some of the fathers we didn't see at all, for example, Pony Zhao's, we weren't ever really clear who her father was, perhaps because the expectation within that culture was that he'd be the breadwinner, the person to go out and get the food for the family, provide for them, protect them, rather than caregive for the child. One cultural difference we note that is evident within our book is that in Latin America, we see this pattern of fathers not only just being a provider or a disciplinarian, but also being highly affectionate and loving with their children, engaging in a lot of play, and being very emotionally available to their children, which is a really positive trend within that specific culture. Fathers in developed countries like Hattie's father, these are people who are or may not be the provider. Sorry, this bullet point is giving me a moment, so hold on one second. Okay, so they might not have as much time with their infants perhaps as the mother if it's a heterosexual couple. Of course, this is limited in that light. But if it's a heterosexual couple, the father may still be the provider in developed countries. They might not get as much time or availability with their child, but they will have more engagement. They tend to play more with their kids than fathers from more traditional cultures. And even though they don't provide a lot of caregiving for their child, they still have some practice in some of those caregiving tasks, such as changing a diaper, providing a meal for a child, or maybe giving them a bath. In the past 10 to 20 years, it's become much more egalitarian, these roles, and that is very evident in Hattie's father's role in the Babies documentary. We see him caregiving, we see him spending time feeding, bathing, playing with her on a beach, and that's a lot more visibility than we saw in any of the other children that were followed in the Babies documentary. So we do see some hints here that as expectations of mothers and fathers shift, with mothers being more likely to be have their own career and working, then this role of caregiving and engagement as much, the level of expectation for fathers is also increasing to be more similar or equal to that of mothers. Of course, this also hints at the fact that being a parent or parenting is something that is learned. It's not something that's innate or inborn, but instead it's something that's modeled for us. So if your father was more engaged in your upbringing, then you're more likely to be an engaged father. So it's something that we observe, that we see, and that we learn to implement in our own lives when we have that opportunity. So we haven't talked a lot about siblings. We've covered fathers. It's kind of cool that, in traditional cultures, older siblings are oftentimes responsible for the care of younger siblings. We saw this oftentimes in the case of Bayer Jagal, who was watched over by his sometimes bullying older brother. The older sibling can provide an emotional comfort and security that the primary caregiver or parent provides when they are around. But when the parent is not around, we do see evidence that young children can form an attachment to their older siblings and actually be calm and collected when their parents leave because they still have an attachment figure present, which is really interesting. Younger siblings can lead to some negative consequences. So a lot of your virtual children are about to have a younger sibling born. You might have just named that younger sibling. And when a younger sibling comes along, all of a sudden the attention and resources of the parents are divided between the two children. And oftentimes the parent that doesn't have enough, has less time for the child is the parent that primarily provided most caregiving for the toddler to begin with. So they experience a lot of jealousy, perhaps increased aggressiveness. My best example of this is that when my niece, Mallory, when her mother had another baby, a little boy, Everett, she was mean to anybody who held Everett, the baby, whether it was her parent, a visitor, a babysitter, it didn't matter. She just flipped a switch and became very aggressive and mean towards that person because there's that jealousy, that need for attention and interaction that is lost when they're no longer the center of attention. So this can provide some behavioral issues for young toddlers as they have to share attention between their parents. So parents can help, but conflict is much more common in siblings than in any other relationship we have across our lifetime. These are generally the people we first try out conflict resolution with. So we get into fights, right? We call each other names and we figure out how to apologize, make up, and go back to playing. But I would give you more guidance here on what parents can do, because there's a lot parents can do to try and ease the tension with the new sibling on board. But I want to save that for your discussion board to peer responses. So I don't want to interject any information. I want you to look for what parents can do to help minimize this conflict as a new sibling is born. So now toddlers now that they're no longer infants, it's often common for them to spend extended periods of time with babysitters or in a daycare. And in those settings, they get more experience interacting with peers that are their same age. So there's different types of play they start to engage in. Initially, it's really common for them to just do solitary play because this is what they do at home when they're alone without these peers. They just play with toys on their own, they entertain themselves, they kind of, manipulate them and learn how to master these toys. Now that they're in a setting with other children, they might try and play near another child or engage in what we call parallel play. They're doing the same exact activity like we see these two children engaged in the picture. They're both playing with these little manipulatives, these little blocks, but they're not talking to each other. They're not sharing necessarily the manipulatives. They're just kind of playing near each other, and that is parallel play. They don't interject or share ideas or share manipulatives. They're just playing very close to each other. Simple social play is when they begin to talk, smile, share different toys with one another, maybe even engage in a storyline with figurines trying to pretend something. So it's much more interactive, this simple social play. And it's much more sophisticated than the prior two types of play. It usually progresses in this order, but even if a child is capable of simple social play, they will still commonly revert back to solitary and parallel play at any given point. So they will engage in all types of play, perhaps within the same day. Toddlers in daycare exhibit social play much sooner because they have this regular practice of being around other children their age. And so they test out interacting or pretending, different role play with these children. Maybe they're gonna play school, for example, and one of them will be the teacher and others will be the students. What we do know is that friendships tend to develop similar to in later ages. They start to have companionship with certain children that they go to daycare with. They care for them. They have emotional closeness with them. They usually have a preferred child or two that they would rather play with. So there is some preference that is expressed at this early toddler age when it comes to peer friendships. Okay, we're starting to wrap up this chapter, but we have to talk about media again. We touched on it in infancy. We do know statistically that 58% of children under 3 watch TV every single day. So remember, I discussed in the infancy chapter that if you're below age 2 and specifically under 18 months, there's absolutely nothing you can learn from TV, and yet most infants have exposure to TV every single day. Toddlers understand images are not real, although they don't entirely understand the pacing, the different perspectives of TV shows can be very confusing for them. It takes a while for them to get used to the more rapid pacing of television that you and I are accustomed to. So TV shows like Mr. Rogers during my upbringing were much more slower paced, much more easy for toddlers to grasp onto and understand. And the slower pacing of television shows for toddlers is important because the slower the pace of the show, the more likely they are to grasp onto content or learn something from the show. Because remember, beyond 18 months, they can learn new words or new educational concepts from a show like Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers. So, media like Mr. Rogers can encourage pro-social behavior, caring for others, putting others' needs first, and helping to learn new problem-solving skills. A lot of the focus of new children's shows today is teaching children how to troubleshoot and find a solution, which is evident, for example, in the show Dora the Explorer or Mickey Mouse's Playhouse, in which they're trying to solve a problem throughout the course of the show. Still, it's recommended by researchers, professionals, pediatricians, that children during toddlerhood should not watch more than 2 hours of television per day. And that includes background television, television that's on in the background. So you really do want to be mindful of when your TV is turned on and off. And if your family or your household is in the practice of always having television on in the background, understand that this is not necessarily a positive thing for the cognitive development of your toddler. So the last topic of this chapter is autism. And we're going to talk about autism because during this period of time, from the time they turn 1 to 3, is when children start to exhibit some symptoms that they might be autistic. This is when they're typically diagnosed today because parents are more aware of common patterns that are associated with being on the spectrum of autism. So some features for diagnosis include that young toddlers aren't really interested in social relationships. Remember that on just 2 slides ago, I talked about how young toddlers do form friendships and preferences to hang out with certain kids. A child who is autistic will not exhibit these same preferences. They also won't develop language in at the same time period as the average child. So remember I mentioned that the first word is most common at around 12 months, and then by 18 months, there's this huge vocabulary spurt where they're fast mapping language. This same progression of language development does not happen at the same time for children who are autistic. In fact, their language tends to be very delayed, and it can be very repetitive in nature initially. They might have a hard time having a back and forth conversation, and so their language will take a much longer time to develop compared to their peers. They also might have a lot of repetitive behaviors. In this case, we see a child, lining up cars, which is pretty typical of most normally developing children, but they might be very particular about the objects they play with, the way that they play with them. Is perhaps very rigid in nature compared to the average child. So these are just some things to look out for with children who are autistic. They have a really hard time making eye contact, is a really common symptom as well, and in conjunction with their slow developing language. When you try and hold a conversation with a child who is autistic, they oftentimes focus in or track your mouth instead of looking at your eyes. So 1 out of 68 toddlers in the US fit the criteria of being on the autistic spectrum disorder. So they can be very high or low functioning. And I like to use a couple of examples of people I've known in my life who fit on different ends of this spectrum. So the first person I'll talk about is a neighbor that I grew up with. My very first best friend, her name was Lindsay. She lived across the street from me. And she had a younger brother who had anoxia at birth. He had the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck. So he was deprived of oxygen for an extended period of time. And shortly after, a couple of months into his infancy, they were able to determine that he was deaf. And by toddlerhood, they were able to diagnose him as autistic or being on the autistic spectrum disorder, because not only could he not hear language, but he never acquired it. He was never able to learn ASL either. He had some cognitive slowness that was comorbid with his other diagnoses. So unfortunately, he wasn't ever able to talk with other children via ASL or language. He did grow up in a developmental home later on and is still alive today. He's in his 30s. He lives in a group home. But it was always like just a heart-wrenching situation for his mother. He would do things such as slamming his fingers repeatedly in doors because he had a sensory processing disorder that was also comorbid with his other diagnoses. So he had a lot of things going on, putting him at the lower end of the autistic spectrum, in which he wasn't as independent or functional on his own. He was always going to be dependent in some case on caregivers or his parents. And on the other side of the spectrum, I will talk about a professor I had in graduate school who, some of the things he would do when we were giving speeches in that class is he would actually count the number of times that a person said like during their speech, and he would report it to the whole class at the conclusion of their speech, which everyone found pretty unnerving and what's another word I would say, inappropriate, I suppose, to report this kind of data with in front of other colleagues that you respected. And about 3 classes into that course, he reported to all of us that he was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which is the high end of autism. You know, he was a professor emeritus, highly published and well-known. So he was very, very intelligent, and many individuals who have this diagnosis of autism can be very specialized, very intelligent, very high achieving. But again, it exists on this wide spectrum. So it's going to depend how, you know, high functioning one can be on that spectrum. Some people have a lot more complications, as I mentioned in the first example with my neighbor, who, you know, was never going to be able to even speak or communicate in a really patterned way with anybody. It is still the case that origins are unclear. I know I've mentioned the vaccine debate before, and how Andrew Wakefield published that fabricated study in which he made up data, fabricating a link between autism and vaccines, which simply is not true. It's never been replicated. And so what we do know is that there might be a constellation of different variables that are responsible for this diagnosis. There might be very specific environmental things at play that contribute to a child developing autism. It's commonly diagnosed between 18 months. Remember, during that time where a normal child would have a vocabulary spurt, these children do not. So this is a typical period of time between 18 and 30 months that a child would be diagnosed with autism. Some autistic individuals may never even develop language, like my neighbor that I mentioned, but oftentimes these people can be highly independent, successful, they get married, they have children. It just depends on where you're at in the spectrum. They can live a very normal, fulfilling life, which is one reason why I take strong offense for all those individuals with autism when you know, their condition is kind of talked about in such a negative way in light of vaccines. So with that, I want to open up email to you all to ask questions about this content. You can also come to my office hours on Wednesday, which are from 1:15 to 2:45, or Friday from 10:45 to 12:15. You can always make an appointment with me too. So I'm there for you. Just let me know what you need. I hope you have a great Wednesday. Take care.